Greetings, fellow travelers. Today we'll be talking about this study that came out in March or so, whenever it is mankind comes out. All right, so it's the usual sort of Emil study. We're going to be looking at country IQ, national IQs, and how they predict immigrant outcomes. And in this case, we're going to be looking at school grade point average, so like the test scores at the end of schooling in Denmark. And it's this study specifically. You can pause and read the abstract if you're into that. I'm not going to read it. So what we have in the world is that we have this situation. We have global bell curve. We have a bunch of countries which have different means or medians or whatever, and IQs, and they have a lot of related inequality in incomes or life expectancy or anything else you can think of, essentially. Scientific outcome. Richard Lynn, of course, published this book in, I think, 2006, and it points out these things and how the various race groups, they also differ like between countries, and they also differ within them. Like you look at Africans in different countries, they tend to be below the Europeans, pretty much no matter what country you look at, and so on. So like there's kind of a world within inside a world, each country, now that we have all these migrants. And so, of course, we are very interested in intelligence, and that's because intelligence is the central trait of social inequality. And to get the feeling for this, we look at, for instance, the studies I've shown here, and these are the person-level studies. So these are studies where someone has some data set, and we're measuring persons, not countries or regions or something, and we're looking at someone's income or education or occupational status, which is a kind of ranking of prestige of occupations. And what we have here in the first meta-analysis is the Strenze 2007 one, and these are only longitudinal studies, so you measure intelligence early-ish in life, and you measure other traits also early in life, and then you look at later outcome, education, occupation, and income. And you can see that we have the kind of average correlation of what we see, so the observed correlation, and since we know that the observed ones are biased downwards due to measurement error and range restriction, these kind of problems, there's a corrected correlation, which is this. And what we see is that if we look at the best studies, we can see that intelligence is slightly better than father's education at predicting own education, but like parental income is much worse. And you can do some other stuff, but essentially intelligence is the most important thing. And the reason father's education is so high is actually father's education is proxying kids' own intelligence, since of course father's education relates to father's own intelligence, and own intelligence levels are heritable in the kids. So it's not that some just get lucky and have higher educated fathers. It also is a measure indirectly of their own intelligence level. And so if you want to do these a proper head-to-head comparison, you would have to put them in a regression model, and then you would see that the intelligence one is much more important. That's what the bell curve did, essentially, right? And you get the same pattern if you look at occupation and if you look at income. Anyway, if you want to zoom out and look at a more diverse set of outcomes, you can look at this list here, and it gives you all kind of meta-analysis that show that intelligence is correlated with all these nice things. And we think these relationships are mostly causal, and that's because we have things like this. Aside from the longitudinal studies, we have sibling studies, and sibling studies, in this case, it's also longitudinal. So here we have the massive Danish study with 171,000 sibling pairs, so 362,000 people in total. And what we can do is that you can look at both people from different families and how they compare. Like that's the same as these prior meta-analysis, but we can also look at sibling pairs. And so you can see one brother will be smarter than the other brother, and they take the IQ test at the Danish army, and then later you can follow up and see how the life is going. And in this case, we're looking at social benefits, so people who got their IQ tested at age 18 or so, because that's when you go and take the army tests, and you can look at their hazard ratio, that's kind of a measure of chance or probability, and at what kind of chance they have to be on social benefits. And you can see it's better to have higher IQs. You want a lower chance, right? So you can see that if we look at the 130 IQs or so, they have something like half the hazard ratio. And if we use these brothers, this is smaller. So some of the IQ effect here is not causal, probably. It's correlated with something else that's important, maybe like good work ethic. Anyway, but there's still a large effect that the very smarties are strongly reduced, and over here you also get the same pattern. Here we have a grade point average, which of course is highly relevant to this specific study since we are looking at migrants. And we get the obvious pattern that people with higher IQ scores also do better in the school grades here. And this, if you're wondering about this weird scale, that's the Danish one where the average can go from -3 down here to 12, but they have cut it off. And we also get the same sort of thing if we do income. And actually income is very close with these two touching. So it seems that almost all the IQ income correlation is actually due to causal effect, if we are to trust the sibling studies. Anyway, so all of these new Danish results, of course, are a replication of older studies, and most famously, after the bell curve came out, there was a lot of dumb sociologist criticism of the regressions in the bell curve, and what they said is that Charles, and Herrnstein, he was dead, but Charles, you haven't really controlled properly for parental stuff, and so if you just do this regression model where we add 1 billion controls of like family stuff, then IQ seems less important. And that's a trivial thing because you can always just add more correlate predictors and they will all kind of tend to go down. And so that's not really telling you about causality here. What you want is that instead you compare the siblings, because when you compare siblings, you don't need to control for anything parental stuff. You just look at the sibling comparisons itself. And what we see is that these values in these two columns are quite similar, as we just saw that in the Danish studies, right? So IQ still predicts when you're predicting among siblings, and that's impossible on a sociological model because according to the sociologist, the reason IQ predicts is because IQ is a proxy for or caused by parental wealth stuff, and you can see that this would lead to the prediction, well, in a large part, that IQ differences among siblings either should not exist at all because they have the same parents, or should not be predictive since it's supposedly a proxy of the more important thing, which is parental wealth. However, we see that that is totally false. Well, sociologists always telling things that are incorrect. Example number, whatever. And here we have brothers in crime, which is of course important if you're interested in crime outcomes. And so this one is comparing I think this one is comparing the full brothers and their proportion with a violent crime conviction. And so you can see in the lowest category, so this will, I don't know, be below 80 IQ or something, there's 20% of people have a violent crime conviction, and if you look at the top one, it's more like, I don't know, 2% or something. So that's a massive difference, right? If you have some group of people who's mostly in, say, these top 3 categories, and you have some other group who's down here, you can see that just from the IQ, you're going to get a massive difference in the average rates of violent crime, right? And so if you just had these people, it would be difficult to build a functioning country since there's just too many violent criminals to kind of make it work. And you would need to spend like extreme amount of money on police and court systems, this sort of thing. And anyway, so many people ask me when I do these studies, why do we add Muslim as a predictor? And it's very simple. If we look at in Europe, all the worst countries that send the people who do the worst in European countries are Muslim countries. And to give one example, here we have the average net what is net bidrag? Net contribution by country of origin in 2007, and so these are based on government data that use government data on income, like how much money you're paying in tax, and we subtract all the money you're getting in social welfare and the money the police is spending trying to catch you and convict you, how much money you're using in schooling and so on. And you get this kind of pattern. You can see the countries that are positive. These are Western countries, which are generally not Muslim ones. And the negative ones are Somalia, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan. I believe all of these are Muslims. MRR, I forgot what that is. Anyway, Turkey is also negative, Pakistan, and so on, right? So the Muslim origin ones are very negative. And so Muslim origin is strongly correlated with lower IQ among immigrant groups in Denmark. So it's hard to see which is doing what. Is it just the lower IQ of the groups that's doing it, or is it also some other thing about these Muslim origins and like some like non-Hashnal line personality types, non-weird personality types? Who knows? And so you have to do the regressions to see if you can pick them apart. And so the causal model that we are really using in these immigrant studies is this one, and it's naturally simplified, but it goes like this. And we have population traits that differ in countries of origin, and these then cause the various countries of origin results, like the wealth of nations is mostly due to the wealth or the inequality of intelligence and some other human capital traits. And when you take people from one country and you move them to another, you get like migrants, and there's going to be some migrant selection. Some countries make it hard to get out. Some countries just shitty. It's hard to get out. You have to bribe people and to get out, and maybe you have to bribe some people to smuggle you into like a nice country like the Mediterranean boat people stuff, and then you have the immigrant outcomes in that new country, and based on these population differences you end up with there, and there's going to be some contextual factors, such as how long you've been there. If you just arrived in a country and you don't speak the language and so on, then it's very difficult to do well. But if you already arrived there and you speak a related language, or at least you speak like nice English, then you're going to be a lot easier, right? Anyway, so the data in this study, we have public official data for the grade point average. These are from standardized testing at the end of compulsory schooling, so that's the 9th grade, about age 15. There's 116 groups, and these are all the groups that they have data for in Denmark. And Denmark, of course, is a kind of small country with maybe 6 million people or so. About 20% of these are foreigners. About a third of the foreigners are other Western people. So 2/3 are going to be non-Westerns of various sorts. Not many Asians. So mostly Muslims and Africans. And in this data, we also have nicely split by first and second generation. And some origin groups, even though we have 160 of them, 116, many of them actually have very few people, like 4 Japanese or whatever, and so that's not very useful. So, but 82 of them have at least 25 people, and so that's fairly useful. The map looks like this. If you take the average GPA and you plot that, and in different color bands, you get this totally unsurprising map that, okay, you can quibble with why is Kazakhstan high, but roughly you get the point that they're low down here, they're kind of low over here, high from other European ones. Chinese is high, Taiwan is high. I don't know why Australia is not so high, but roughly, right, you get the pattern, right? And if we split this by generations, you get similar things, just with a bit more noise, right? Here we have first generations, apparently Argentinians are doing right, but in second generations they're not doing okay. So maybe something happens in this, that the second generation Argentinians are different kind of people than the first generation ones, or maybe it's just sampling error, right? It's not. You shouldn't really get hang up on like small differences, just big patterns. One interesting thing about this study that we've been looking at, and we didn't do in the prior studies, or I didn't do, is that you can also look at immigrant selectivity. And immigrant selectivity, of course, should impact the outcomes. And so most people know that in the US, you have people from South Africa, and the people from South Africa in the US, they do quite well. And that's because the people from South Africa who was in the US, well, those are like the white returnees and the Jews, right? And so those are people who migrate there, and then they got taken over by Africans, and they're like, I'm out of here. And then they go to the US, the very elite of them, and the other ones end up in like Europe or whatever. And you have the same thing for India. India, mean IQ 82 or so. But somehow the ones who end up in US are highly selected. These come over there on the to work in the tech industry, right? They come from the elite universities of India, and so the ones in the US have like a mean IQ of 105, 110, something like that. And many of them also have a relevant education. So not only are they selected on IQ, they're also selected on personality traits that make you able to get a university education. So what we have here is that there's an institute that does survey research. I don't know how they do this on immigrants. So people who want to leave a country, the immigrants with an E, not an I, and so they get a educational level index of those, and you can compare that to the people in the country. And the more selected the outgoing ones are, obviously that should reflect in the outcomes when they go to different places. So if you have super selected people from a low mean IQ, then they're going to go to maybe like high or just average IQ. And if you have like negative selection from a negative country, then you could be quite low IQ and so on. And specifically, they do combinations of countries. So you can look at immigrant from, say, Australia to Denmark in a specific period, and you can calculate this index of selectivity, educational selectivity index. And when you do that for Denmark, it looks like this. And so we see that Denmark kind of got nicer immigrants, like the light green means average, and the yellow is like below average immigrants. So it seems that North African ones we get are somewhat below average, and the ones we got from whatever this country is it Bolivia or something? Yeah, I think maybe it's Bolivia, or maybe it's Paraguay. Well, whatever. Those ones were not good, and the ones from Turkey were terrible, and also from wherever that is, and also from these Baltic states. And it's not perfect index because it's measured also by early in life sometimes when they leave. And so if you have elites that come to your countries, they're actually quite smart, but they haven't finished education yet. So by educational standards, they look very bad since there's no age control in this index, as I recall. That's a problem, but it's a good start, right? Anyway, so if we do the very basics, we're going to be looking at the correlations for the GPA average, and we weigh them by the square root of the sample size to kind of ignore some of the noise effect. And if we do that, we have these four different measures of intelligence at home, and we see that they all correlate moderately nicely at like 0.5 or so, 0.47 for the Lin one, and 5.3 for the Rinderman one, and 5.2 for the Becker's recomputations. And this is the World Bank one, and yeah, that's just a typo. It is actually supposed to be IQ. Anyway, Muslim also correlates minus 0.4, which is reasonable, and educational selection has a positive correlation. And so everything correlates the way we'd expect it. And nicely is that if we look at the educational selection, we see that it's actually not highly correlated with the other variables. And so, of course, when you have predictors that are not highly correlated, that means they should function well when you put them in a regression model together, right? And if we want to look at the results by variate, like scatter plot, it looks like this. That's for all the countries. One of them is missing. I guess it has no IQ. And it looks like this. The scatter size determines how many people are there. So we have a lot of Turks, and we have a lot of Vietnamese, and a lot of Bosnians, and these other like Yugoslavian people. And you can see that there's a nice correlation here, right? And again, don't get too hung up on like weird things like why is Taiwan so much higher than China? The answer is I don't know. Probably no one knows. And why is Kazakhstan so high? Why is Malaysia high? I don't know exactly. And why is Czech Republic low? I don't know. So don't ask these questions. You're just looking at the average here. And you can see that the outliers tend to be very small samples, which of course tells you that likely sampling error has a lot to do with why these specific countries are high and these specific countries are low. Not Thailand. I don't know why Thailand is low. If we do only at the larger groups of at least 25 people, you see things look more reasonable. The correlation stays about the same, but that's because we used weighting before to give most of the statistical attention to the big groups. If we do like this, then it looks a lot more linear with no like weird outliers here, and there's still some differences, like why is Vietnam so good compared to Thailand? We don't really know, but if we do instead by generation, and so remember here that we have first and second generation, and maybe there's some difference between these, and it may be then a good idea to split them up. And once you do like this, you get this results, and still you have like a nice correlation, 42. If you do it by Muslim instead, you get a 438. It was 0.40 before, so not so much difference. Again, these are all the Muslim majority countries, and they tend to do not very well, and over here they do better, but we also have a bunch of non-Muslim countries that do poorly, but usually these are low IQ countries like Congo here. And again, if we do educational selection, we get the expected pattern here, including when we split up by generation. So what we want to do then next is we combine them in a regression, and if we do the combined one first, so here we merge the data. With first and second generation, and we look only at the ones with 25 people at least, and then you get this result. And we see that in the final model here that IQ is positive, Muslim is negative, but non-significantly so. But you can see the p-value is 7% here, so it's borderline significant or whatever. And educational selectivity is also there. Actually, this is a standard error, right? Okay, never mind the borderline. And it's going to be very close. If we do it with the generations, it's down here like this. And now everything is works out as you'd expect in the final model. But that's not because things are so much different. It's because that the sample size is something like 25 people or 25 countries larger over here. And that's because they're not split, so every country that has at least data for both generations can now contribute more than one data point, right? And so we see that the effect of being foreign-born first generation is actually quite large. It's a 2/3 of a standard deviation that you do worse on the standardized testing here if you are born in a different country. Probably this relates mostly to language bias. If we had individual level data, of course, we could look at, say, people who came to Denmark, was born elsewhere, but they came to Denmark, say, when they're like below 6, and so these people should speak more or less perfect Danish, and you could check if the foreign-born effect would be different for those, and it probably would be smaller, right? And IQ core predicts, Muslim predicts natively, education selection. So everything kind of works out nicely compared to our theory, and the overall model explains almost half the variance in GPA, which is quite good considering that the outcome that we have is quite noisy, right? So what we can ask also is that how much p-hacking went into the 25 people? What if Emil was being sneaky and picking some number that made him look good? So we can do this, and then we can vary this threshold, and we can say that what if instead we wanted 100 people at least in a sample, and the correlations then would be looking like this. So you can see that essentially the correlations, they get slightly better for every, they get slightly stronger for every predictor once you increase the threshold for inclusion. And so actually using 25, which is here, is actually, you should maybe use like 50 or something, 60 or whatever, then it comes slightly stronger. So there's basically some noise countries that are country more noise than data here. So we shouldn't really be too worried about this thresholding by sample size. And so the conclusions of the study is that, summary, we have a large new dataset, Danish dataset, and we have business as usual, national IQs work, Muslim percentages, they predict stuff, selection effects are present, everything kind of works out that the way simple migration theory should tell us. We find the same thing every study we do, which is nice, like we have science that replicates every time. This kind of study is only mildly informative by causes itself, right? Maybe something other than national IQ is actually super causal here, but that is only really the case when we ignore the other 100 years of research that shows that intelligence is not only important as a predictor, but it's causally important for social outcomes. And in fact, the social hierarchy is mostly an intelligence hierarchy, right? That's also what modern GWAS genetic studies show. They show high correlations, genetic correlations between intelligence and these like education or health and blah, 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 right? And it would be, of course, much nicer to have person level data, but since I am a non-professor of nowhere, I can't really get those. So that's pretty much the story of the study. And so basically this is the conclusion. Goodbye.